Welcome to my channel, Sherlock Holmes Stories, Inkwing Audio.
It was a November evening in the year 189, of such grim and oppressive character that I remember it vividly even now, years later. A yellow fog, thick as wool and pungent with the acrid scent of coal smoke, had settled over London, choking the street lamps until they were mere blurred nebulas in the gloom outside our windows at 221B Baker Street. The city was muffled, the usual clatter of hansom cabs and the cries of vendors reduced to a ghostly murmur. Inside our sitting room, the atmosphere was hardly less charged, though of a different nature. My friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, was in one of those states of high-strung restlessness that invariably seized him when the criminal world was inconsiderate enough to remain dormant for too long. He had spent the better part of 3 days pacing the Persian rug, consuming an alarming amount of strong shag tobacco and lamenting the dearth of imagination among the London criminal classes. "Stagnation, Watson," he had declared only an hour prior, throwing himself into his armchair and staring moodily at the coals. "My mind is like a racing engine tearing itself apart for lack of a connection. The whole city is asleep, and I am condemned to watch it slumber." I, meanwhile, was attempting to find solace in a recent medical journal, though Holmes's agitated vibrations made concentration nearly impossible. I had just resolved to suggest a game of chess, hoping to divert his immense energies, when the silence of the street below was shattered. It began with a frantic drumming of hooves on cobblestones, muffled by the fog but approaching at a dangerous speed. This was followed by the screech of iron-shod wheels grinding against the curb directly beneath our window. A moment later, our street door bell was rung, not with the polite tug of a visitor, but with a continuous, desperate violence that suggested the ringer intended to tear the mechanism from the wall. Holmes was on his feet in an instant, his lethargy shed like an old coat. His eyes, previously dull with boredom, now gleamed with predatory intent. "Hark, Watson!" he hissed, tilting his head towards the stairwell. "Unless I am very much mistaken, the stagnation is at an end. That is the ring of a man pursued by the very hounds of hell." We heard the hurried footsteps of our long-suffering landlady, Mrs. Hudson, hastening down the hall, followed by the sound of the heavy oak door being unlatched. Immediately there was a commotion, a choked cry, a heavy thud, and Mrs. Hudson's shriek of alarm. Without exchanging a word, Holmes and I seized our revolvers from the drawer and took the stairs 2 at a time. The scene in the gas-lit hallway was chaotic. Mrs. Hudson stood pressed against the wall, her hands to her mouth, staring wide-eyed at the figure sprawled across the linoleum mat. A man lay there, gasping for air in shuddering, rattling breaths. He was perhaps 50 years of age, dressed in the impeccable evening clothes of a gentleman who had been dining out. A silk top hat had rolled into the corner, and his expensive fur-lined overcoat was splashed with fresh mud. Yet, despite the finery, his appearance was ghastly. His face was suffused with a cyanotic purple hue. His eyes were rolling back in their sockets, and a thin trickle of saliva, tinged with an unnatural shade of blue, leaked from the corner of his mouth. I rushed to his side, my medical instincts overriding my shock. I loosened his collar, feeling for a pulse. It was there, but thready and racing uncontrollably. "Poison," I said, looking up at Holmes, who stood over us, his features composed into a mask of intense, rigid concentration, and a virulent one at that. "He is going fast." The dying man's eyes suddenly focused. He seemed to see Holmes, and a flicker of desperate recognition crossed his tortured face. He reached out a trembling, gloved hand, clutching at the lapel of Holmes's dressing gown. He tried to speak, but only a harsh, gurgling sound emerged. "Focus, man," Holmes said, his voice low and commanding, leaning close to the dying man's lips. "You have come to 221B. You are safe now. What is it you wish to tell me?" The man summoned a final agonizing effort. His lips writhed, and I leaned in close to catch the words that escaped with his last exhalation. The consortium, he wheezed, the words barely audible. They know. The fourth axiom is broken. Tell my wife. The blueprint. His head fell back against the linoleum with a dull wooden sound. The hand clutching Holmes's robe went slack. I pressed my ear to his chest for a moment, then straightened up, shaking my head slowly. He is gone, Holmes. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the distant, mournful foghorn from the river. We stood in the hallway of our own home, staring down at the corpse of a complete stranger who had used his final moments of life to deliver a riddle to Sherlock Holmes's doorstep. Holmes remained motionless for a long moment, his grey eyes narrowed, staring not with sorrow, but with a piercing analytical fixity at the dead man's face. Then he straightened, pulling his dressing gown free from the dead man's loosened grip. "Well, Watson," Holmes said, his voice icy calm, yet vibrating with suppressed excitement. "It seems the game is not only afoot, it has kicked down our very door. We must send for Lestrade immediately. But before the official stampede obliterates everything of value, let us see what this poor devil has brought us besides a cryptic message and a ruined evening." While we waited for the arrival of the police, Holmes directed the brawny commissionaire from the corner to help carry the unfortunate gentleman into our sitting room, laying him upon the sofa. Mrs. Hudson, having recovered her composure with the resilience of a veteran of Baker Street's many dramas, had been dispatched to fetch Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard. Holmes stood by the mantelpiece, his pipe unlit, watching as I performed a more thorough, albeit futile, examination of the deceased. The heavy fog outside seemed to press against the window panes, isolating us in that candle-lit room with the mystery of the consortium. "A singular business, Watson," Holmes remarked, his eyes roaming the room. "Even for our colourful history, to have a man expire upon our threshold with a riddle on his lips is a trifle dramatic, is it not?" "It is a tragedy, Holmes," I replied, covering the man's face with my handkerchief. "He was a man of substance. His hands are soft, his linen is of the finest Irish weave, and his boots, though muddy, are handcrafted by Moikoff. He was no common brawler." Holmes took a few steps toward me, a thin, ironic smile playing on his lips. "Quite so. And I see that your own morning was spent in the company of a gouty patient in the vicinity of the Stepney docks, likely a retired sea captain with a penchant for cheap gin." I stared at him in amazement. "My dear Holmes, how could you possibly know that?" "I did indeed visit an old patient in Stepney this morning, but I mentioned it to no one." "It is simplicity itself, Watson. There is a specific greyish clay found only in the excavations near the Stepney basin. A deposit of it clings to the instep of your left boot. The faint, persistent odour of juniper and low-grade alcohol which emanates from your medical bag suggests a spill, likely from a patient's glass. Given your own temperate habits, the deduction is elementary. But let us not waste time on the living when the dead provide such a fascinating study." He knelt beside the sofa, his long, thin fingers moving with the delicacy of a surgeon. He did not look at the man's face, but rather at his fingernails, the tips of his ears, and the curious discoloration of his lips. "The blue tint is most suggestive, Watson. As a medical man, what do you make of the fourth axiom he mentioned?" "In a medical context, an axiom is a self-evident truth," I mused. "But the fourth axiom sounds more like the language of a mathematician or perhaps a philosopher. As for the poison, the rapid onset and the cyanosis suggest a concentrated alkaloid, perhaps a derivative of aconitum, though the blue staining of the saliva is a detail I have never encountered in any textbook." "An unnatural shade of blue, you called it," Holmes murmured, pulling a magnifying glass from his pocket. "It is not merely a symptom, it is a residue. See here." He pointed to a tiny, almost invisible puncture mark on the man's neck, just below the jawline. Surrounding the prick was a faint, sapphire-colored ring. "He was not fed this poison, Watson. He was struck with it. Perhaps a needle, perhaps a dart. He fled here, knowing he was dying, seeking the one man he believed could protect whatever secret he carried. He called it his last call, a final appeal to the court of Baker Street." "But who is he?" I asked, "and what is this consortium?" "The name is unfamiliar to me, which is a rarity in itself," Holmes admitted, his brow furrowing. "But look at his pockets. They have been systematically emptied of all identification. No wallet, no calling cards, no watch. And yet," Holmes reached into the man's small fob pocket, a place a hurried thief might overlook. He withdrew a small, crumpled piece of vellum. On it was sketched a complex geometric pattern, a circle inscribed within a square, bisected by 4 intersecting lines. Beneath the drawing, a single line of elegant, hurried script read, "The clock strikes 13 in the House of Glass." "A blueprint?" I suggested, recalling the man's dying words. "Or a map of a mind's obsession," Holmes replied, his eyes gleaming. "The man's evening clothes suggest he was at a formal function, perhaps a gala or a private club. He was attacked there, or shortly after leaving. He took a cab, but the driver did not stay to help. Why? Because the driver was either terrified or complicit." He paced the room, the shadows lengthening as the fire burned low. "Think of it, Watson. A man of wealth and standing is hunted through the fog, struck down by a poison unknown to science, and dies gasping about a broken axiom and a secret consortium. It is a masterpiece of malice. It challenges the very foundations of logic." Just then, the heavy tread of boots sounded on the stairs. The door swung open to reveal the wiry, ferret-like features of Inspector Lestrade. He looked from us to the body, a mixture of annoyance and professional curiosity on his face. "Well, Mr. Holmes," Lestrade said, tapping his notebook, "I see you've gone and got a corpse in the parlor again. I hope you have a simpler explanation for this one than the last." "On the contrary, Lestrade," Holmes said, his voice dropping to a whisper of intense excitement, "I fear this is a case where the simple explanations will be the first casualties of the truth." Lestrade, ever the pragmatist of Scotland Yard, stood over the body with his notebook in hand, his expression one of weary skepticism. "A gentleman in evening dress collapses on your mat, gasping about axioms and blueprints, and you call it a masterpiece of malice, Holmes. To me it looks like a clear-cut case of a man with a weak heart and a confused mind wandering out of a dinner party into the fog." "And the blue-stained saliva, Lestrade, the puncture wound on the neck?" Holmes asked, his voice sharp with a hint of impatience. "Do hearts often leave sapphire-colored rings upon the skin when they fail?" Lestrade shrugged, though he leaned in to peer at the mark. "A skin condition, perhaps, or a reaction to some medication. As for the words, men in the throes of a seizure often speak gibberish." "Gibberish is rarely so specific," Holmes remarked, turning toward the window. "But let us look for more tangible evidence. Watson, grab your coat." The fog is thick, but it cannot hide everything from a persistent lantern. We descended the stairs, leaving Lestrade to oversee the removal of the body. Outside, the hansom cab that had delivered the dying man remained where it had stopped. The horse, a sturdy bay, stood shivering in the damp air, its breath blooming in white clouds. To my surprise, the driver's seat was vacant. "The driver has vanished," I noted, peering into the gloom of the street. "Naturally," Holmes replied, clicking on his dark lantern. "Had he been an honest cabman, he would have stayed to demand his fare or offer assistance. That he fled into the fog tells us he was either an accomplice or a man so terrified that he abandoned his livelihood to escape the proximity of his passenger." Holmes began a methodical examination of the cab's interior. I watched, fascinated as always, as he moved with the precision of a bloodhound on a fresh scent. He ignored the plush leather seats and the velvet curtains, focusing instead on the floorboards and the narrow crevices of the doorframe. "Aha!" he exclaimed, plucking something from the hinge of the folding door with his tweezers. He held it up to the lantern. It was a tiny, jagged shard of translucent material, not glass, but something more crystalline and oddly iridescent. "What do you make of this, Watson?" "It looks like a fragment of a high-quality lens," I suggested, "or perhaps a decorative crystal from a chandelier." "Perhaps, but notice the edges. They are coated in a fine, crystalline powder of a distinctly azure hue." He placed the fragment into a glass vial. And look here on the floor mat." He pointed to a series of faint white streaks. To my eye they were merely scuffs, but Holmes knelt and sniffed the air near the floor. "Ozone," he whispered. "The sharp metallic scent of an electrical discharge. Watson, our friend did not come from a dinner party. He came from a laboratory, or a factory of a very peculiar sort." He moved to the front of the cab, examining the mud on the wheels. He scraped a sample into a piece of paper, peering at it through his magnifying glass. "Heavy London clay," he muttered, "but mixed with a fine white silt. There is only one area in the metropolis where such a combination is common, the industrial district near the Isle of Dogs, specifically where the new chemical works are being erected." "But Holmes," I protested, "a man in such fine evening clothes would have no business in the industrial wastes of the Isle of Dogs at such an hour." "Precisely, which makes his presence there all the more significant. He was a man of two worlds, Watson, one of silk hats and consortiums, and another of blueprints, axioms, and the house of glass." He turned his attention to the horse, checking its hooves and then the harness. He pulled a small, crumpled slip of paper from the driver's whip socket. "What is it?" I asked. "A destination receipt from a private carriage hire in South Lambeth," Holmes said, his eyes flashing in the lantern light. "Dated today, it bears no name, only a set of coordinates and a single word written in a different hand. Refraction." "Refraction?" I repeated. "The bending of light? Indeed, a term from the realm of optics. Our puzzle is beginning to take on a very specific shape, Watson. We have a house of glass, a fourth axiom, which in optics refers to the path of least time, and now refraction. It seems we are dealing with a crime of science." We heard Lestrade's voice calling from the doorway. "Are you coming back in, Holmes? We found something in his overcoat lining that might interest you." We hurried back inside. Lestrade held up a small leather-bound diary. It had been sewn into the inner lining of the man's fur-trimmed coat. "It's a journal of some kind," Lestrade said, looking smug. "But it's all in code, just rows and rows of numbers and symbols. Doesn't mean a thing to me." Holmes snatched the book with a hunger that was almost frightening. He flipped through the pages, his gaze darting across the lines of cipher. "It is not merely a code, Lestrade," Holmes said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble. "It is a record of a betrayal, and if my reading of these initial symbols is correct, the last call our friend made to Baker Street was the only thing standing between London and a catastrophe of unparalleled proportions." "A catastrophe?" I asked, a chill running down my spine. "The consortium," Holmes said, looking up from the book, his face pale in the gaslight. "They aren't just a group of criminals, Watson. They are architects of chaos, and the house of glass is about to shatter." By the following morning, the yellow fog had thinned into a dismal grey drizzle, but the gloom of the weather was entirely eclipsed by the electric energy radiating from Sherlock Holmes. He had not slept. When I descended to the sitting room, I found him surrounded by a sea of open reference books and chemical charts, the coded diary of the deceased resting open upon his knee. "The man was Sir Alistair Sterling, Watson," Holmes announced, skipping any morning salutations as he gestured toward a discarded copy of the Daily Telegraph. "The obituary columns haven't caught up with the fact yet, but the man's identity was confirmed by his signet ring, which, curiously, was not in his pocket, but tucked into the secret lining of his waistcoat, alongside the diary." "Sir Alistair Sterling," I mused, pouring myself a cup of coffee. "The pioneer in telescopic lenses and lighthouse magnification. He was a Fellow of the Royal Society, and a man of immense wealth," Holmes added, his eyes bright. "He lived at Stirling Hall in Highgate, but his true passion was the House of Glass, a sprawling modern laboratory in the Isle of Dogs, where he developed high-frequency signaling devices for the Admiralty. The fourth axiom he mentioned is a reference to Fermat's principle of least time, specifically as it applies to the refraction of light through complex prisms. It seems our victim was working on something far more significant than mere lighthouses. A sharp knock at the door preceded the entry of Inspector Lestrade. The Scotsman looked remarkably pleased with himself, his chest puffed out with the air of a man who had completed a difficult puzzle in record time. "Well, Holmes, I've got him," Lestrade declared, tossing his damp hat onto the sideboard. "The case is as good as closed. It was a matter of simple jealousy and a disgruntled employee, just as I suspected." Holmes arched a thin eyebrow. "Indeed? And who is this unfortunate individual?" "Julian Vane," Lestrade said. "Sir Alister's lead assistant at the Isle of Dogs laboratory. We found him at his lodgings in South Lambeth this morning, preparing to flee to the continent. When we searched his room, we found a set of glass-cutting tools and, more importantly, a vial of the very same blue chemical that stained the victim's lips. It's a rare cobalt-based neurotoxin used in the glass tempering process." "And the motive?" I asked. "Vane had been passed over for a partnership in the firm last month," Lestrade replied. "We found a letter in his desk written by Sir Alister, formally dismissing him for unethical experimentation. Vane was seen arguing with Sir Alister at the lab yesterday evening. A witness, a night watchman, saw Vane follow Sir Alister out into the fog, carrying a small metallic object." "It seems quite damning," I remarked, looking at Holmes. My friend, however, was staring at the ceiling, his long, thin fingers joined at the tips. "It is indeed a beautiful chain of evidence, Lestrade. Almost too beautiful. Tell me, did Mr. Vane offer any defense?" "The usual denials," Lestrade scoffed. "Claimed he was at the theatre, though he couldn't produce a ticket stub. He looked like a man who had seen a ghost when we showed him the blue vial. He's in the cells at Bow Street now. I should very much like to visit the House of Glass before we congratulate ourselves," Holmes said, rising and reaching for his frock coat. "And perhaps a brief word with the night watchman, who was so conveniently placed to witness the beginning of the end." The laboratory was a striking structure of iron and vast reinforced panes of glass, standing like a skeletal cathedral amidst the soot-stained brickwork of the docks. Inside, the air was cold and smelled of ozone and acid. We were met by the night watchman, a burly, nervous man named Miller. "I saw them, Mr. Holmes," Miller said, his voice trembling as we stood in the main hall of the laboratory. "Sir Alister was shouting about the blueprint and the consortium. Mr. Vane was white as a sheet, clutching his black leather bag. They went out into the fog together toward the carriage stand." Holmes ignored the man's testimony for a moment, his gaze fixed on a large central pedestal where a massive, intricate lens, the size of a carriage wheel, sat partially covered by a canvas sheet. He walked over to it, his magnifying glass already in hand. "Watson, look here," Holmes whispered. I leaned in. On the edge of the lens, near the iron mount, was a faint smudge of the same azure powder, but next to it, partially obscured by the frame, was a small sticky residue of what appeared to be common candle wax. "Vane is a man of science," Holmes murmured, more to himself than to me. "A man who works in a laboratory illuminated by the latest Edison electric lamps. Why would he be using a tallow candle near a £1,000,000 optical instrument?" He then turned to the floor, following a trail of faint scuff marks that led not toward the exit, but toward a heavy reinforced door marked Private Research Division. "Lestrade," Holmes said, his voice ringing through the hollow building. "You have your man, and you have your motive, but you are missing the most vital component of a crime, the logic. If Vane killed Sir Alister to steal his secrets, why leave the coded diary on the body? Why leave the blue vial in his own top drawer? A man clever enough to synthesize a cobalt neurotoxin is not a man who leaves his calling card at the scene of the crime. Then who did it?" Lestrade asked, his face reddening. "That," Holmes said, looking through the private door's keyhole, "is what we shall find behind the House of Glass. This consortium is not a group of disgruntled assistants, Watson. It is something far more organized. And Vane is not their leader, he is their scapegoat." He straightened up, his eyes flashing with a cold, predatory light. "The evidence against Vane is a masterpiece of stagecraft, designed to satisfy the police and close the book. But the clock, as our dead friend warned us, is striking 13. We must move quickly. The private research division of the House of Glass was a sanctuary of high science far removed from the grime of the Isle of Dogs. It was a circular chamber, its walls lined with mahogany cabinets filled with delicate brass instruments, prisms of every conceivable shape, and rows of leather-bound ledgers. In the center stood a secondary pedestal, smaller than the one in the main hall, currently draped in a black velvet cloth. Lestrade stood in the center of the room, his hands on his hips, surveying the scene with an air of completion. "You see, Holmes, everything is in its place." Sir Alister was working late. Vane came in through the side door. We found his muddy footprints in the corridor, they argued. Vane struck him with the poisoned needle and fled. He even knocked over this tray of slides in his haste. He pointed to a scattered mess of glass plates on the floor. Holmes, however, was not looking at the slides. He had moved to the central pedestal and pulled back the velvet cloth. Beneath it lay a device of exquisite complexity, a series of nested silver rings holding a central lens that seemed to glow with an inner milky light. "Is this the signaling device?" I asked, leaning closer. "It is a prototype, Watson," Holmes murmured, his eyes scanning the delicate calibrations. "A revolutionary method of transmitting information via light waves. But look at the settings." He pulled a small magnifying glass from his pocket and peered at the vernier scale on the side of the instrument. His face, usually so inscrutable, flickered with a momentary spark of surprise. He then turned his attention to the desk where Sir Alister had presumably been working. A single sheet of paper lay there, weighted down by a brass paperweight in the shape of a sphinx. On it were several lines of complex equations. I recognized the mathematical notation for refraction, non sin theta 1 n 2 sin theta 2, but several of the variables had been crossed out with a violent, shaky hand. Beside the equations, the words "the fourth axiom is broken" were scrawled in thick black ink. "You see?" Lestrade said, peering over Holmes's shoulder. "The man was losing his mind. Broken axioms. It's the talk of a lunatic." "On the contrary, Lestrade," Holmes said softly, "it is the talk of a man who has made a discovery so terrifying that it threatened the very laws of the universe as he understood." Holmes began to move around the room with that peculiar bird-like gait of his. He ignored the obvious signs of a struggle that Lestrade so prized. Instead, he knelt by the fireplace, which was cold and filled with grey ash. He reached in, his long fingers sifting through the remains of burned papers. He withdrew a small, unburned scrap, no larger than a postage stamp, and examined it with intense focus. I watched him closely. I saw his eyes widen for a fraction of a second. He quickly slipped the scrap into his waistcoat pocket, his expression returning to its mask of bored detachment. "Find something, Holmes?" Lestrade asked, his tone slightly mocking. "A trifle, Lestrade. A mere fragment of a grocery list, I believe," Holmes replied smoothly. He then walked over to a large, ornate mirror that hung on the far wall. He stood before it, not looking at his own reflection, but at the reflection of the laboratory behind him. "Watson," he said, "come here. Tell me what you see in the mirror." I joined him. "I see the room, Holmes, the pedestal, the desk, the scattered slides. And the light from the window is reflected quite clearly. Look at the angle of the ray hitting the Sphinx paperweight," Holmes directed. I looked. The morning sun, now breaking through the clouds, sent a sharp beam of light across the room. It struck the brass Sphinx and reflected onto the mirror. However, to my immense surprise, the reflection in the mirror did not show the beam of light hitting the Sphinx. In the glass, the desk appeared to be in shadow. "How is that possible?" I whispered, a cold shiver tracing my spine. "It is a physical impossibility." "Precisely," Holmes whispered back, so low that Lestrade could not hear. "The House of Glass is not merely a name, Watson. It is a deception. The fourth axiom, the principle that light takes the path of least time, has been artificially manipulated. This room is not as it appears." He turned back to Lestrade, his voice regaining its usual crisp tone. "Well, Inspector, I believe I have seen enough. You have your suspect in Julian Vane. The evidence is indeed overwhelming." Lestrade beamed. "I thought you'd see it my way eventually, Holmes. I'll head back to the yard and begin the formal charging process." "You do that, Lestrade," Holmes said. ushering us toward the door. "Watson and I shall take a stroll through the Isle of Dogs. The air here is remarkably illuminating." Once we were outside, the heavy iron doors of the laboratory clanging shut behind us, I turned to my friend. "Holmes, why did you play along with Lestrade? You clearly found something in that fireplace and that mirror. It was haunting." Holmes stopped in his tracks, his eyes dark with a sudden fierce intensity. "I played along, Watson, because the man who killed Sir Alistair Sterling was never in that room. The muddy footprints were made by someone wearing Vane's boots, yes, but the stride was 4 inches too short for a man of Vane's height. The blue vial in Vane's desk was placed there by a hand that did not know Vane is colorblind and would never have used a blue-labeled reagent by mistake. Then who—" "The scrap I found in the fire, Watson," Holmes said, withdrawing the tiny piece of paper. On it was a partial seal, a crown intertwined with a compass. "This is the mark of the Royal Naval Intelligence. Sir Alistair wasn't just working for the Admiralty, he was working against a shadow within it." He looked back at the glistening glass roof of the laboratory. "The consortium has already won the first round. They have the man they want in jail, and they have the world believing a genius went mad. But they made one mistake. And that was? They left the mirror," Holmes said grimly. "Now come, we must find a very specific type of artisan. We are looking for a man who can build a window that sees only what it is told to see." The next 48 hours were a trial of patience and nerves. Sherlock Holmes had descended into one of those states of cold, frenetic energy that I had learned to dread and admire in equal measure. He had transformed our sitting room into a chaotic optical laboratory. The Persian rug was littered with shards of high-grade flint glass, and a series of powerful lanterns were positioned at precise angles, their beams intersecting through a collection of prisms he had acquired from a specialist in Clerkenwell. Holmes himself was a spectre of his usual self. He had neither eaten nor slept, his cheekbones protruding sharply and his eyes burning with an almost feverish intensity. He spent hours sketching complex geometric diagrams, often muttering to himself about the refraction of deception and the shadow in the light. "It is a masterpiece of physics, Watson," he cried out suddenly around 2 o'clock in the morning. He was holding a small triangular prism up to a gas jet. "The fourth axiom is not merely broken, it has been weaponized. Sir Alistair didn't discover a flaw in nature, he discovered how to create one." "My dear Holmes," I protested, rising from my chair, "you are speaking in riddles. What does a broken law of optics have to do with the murder of a knighted scientist?" "Everything," Holmes snapped, his long, thin fingers tracing a path through the air. "Consider Snell's law, non a sin theta 1, equal to n to sin theta 2. It dictates how light must bend when moving between mediums. But what if one could manipulate the refractive index so precisely that light does not merely bend, but flows around an object? Like water around a stone in a stream." "You mean invisibility?" I asked, the word sounding absurd even as I spoke it. "Not invisibility, Watson. Displacement. A man could be standing in the center of a room, and yet the light reaching your eyes would carry only the image of the wall behind him. The mirror in the house of glass was a test. The room we saw was a projection, a carefully curated lie. Sir Alistair was murdered because he realized his invention, intended for the Admiralty's signaling, was being subverted to hide something far more sinister." Our discussion was interrupted by a violent pounding at the door. I checked my watch. It was nearly 3 in the morning. A moment later, a haggard and breathless Inspector Lestrade burst into the room. He no longer bore the smug expression of a man who had solved a case. His face was pale and his collar was askew. "He's gone, Holmes," Lestrade gasped, collapsing into the armchair. "Who?" "Julian Vane," I asked. "No, not Vane. Miller, the night watchman from the Isle of Dogs. We found him an hour ago, washed up against the pilings of the Tower Bridge, the same blue tint on the lips, the same puncture mark on the neck." Holmes straightened, his lethargy vanishing. "And Vane? What of him?" "That's the worst of it," Lestrade said, his voice trembling. "Someone bypassed the guards at Bow Street. The cell was found locked from the inside, the key still in the guard's pocket. Vane is gone, Holmes. Not a trace, not a struggle. It's as if he simply vanished into the air, or was walked out of the station in plain sight, obscured by the very technology I suspected, Holmes whispered, his voice like a chill blade. But there is more, is there not, Lestrade? Your face tells of a third tragedy. Lestrade nodded grimly. A carriage was found abandoned on the Highgate Road. It belonged to the Sterling estate. Lady Sterling's shawl was on the seat, and there were signs of a struggle. She has been abducted. Holmes began to pace the room with the ferocity of a caged tiger. The stakes have risen beyond a simple murder. Miller was silenced because he knew Vane was innocent. Vane was taken because they need his technical expertise to complete the work Sir Alistair refused to finish, and Lady Sterling is the leverage to ensure his cooperation. He stopped suddenly, staring at the coded diary that still lay on the mantelpiece. "The clock strikes 13 in the House of Glass," he quoted softly. "Watson, what is the significance of 13? "It is the devil's dozen," I suggested. "A sign of bad luck." "Or," Holmes countered, his eyes widening with a sudden terrible realization, "it is a reference to a time that does not exist on a standard clock. It refers to a military countdown. The House of Glass isn't just the laboratory, Watson. It's the London Stock Exchange. The entire building is roofed in glass." "The Stock Exchange?" Lestrade cried. "What could they want there?" "Chaos, Lestrade. If the consortium can manipulate the visual information of the exchange, the tickers, the boards, the very documents in the broker's hands, they could trigger a financial collapse that would bring the empire to its knees in a single afternoon. And with Lady Sterling as a hostage, they have the perfect shield." Holmes seized his deerstalker and his heavy ulster coat. "Lestrade, summon every man you can trust to the city, but tell them to trust nothing they see with their own eyes. Watson, bring your service revolver. We have less than 6 hours before the exchange opens, and I fear we are about to enter a world where even the shadows have teeth." The pre-dawn light of London was less a sunrise and more a gradual thinning of the charcoal sky into a bruised, sickly purple. As the city began its slow, mechanical awakening, I found myself standing on the corner of Threadneedle Street, shivering despite my heavy ulster. Beside me stood a man I would not have recognized had I not watched him spend 3 hours at his dressing table, an elderly, hunched street sweeper with a matted beard, a glass eye that stared fixedly at nothing, and a cough that sounded like gravel turning in a drum. "Steady, Watson," the creature wheezed, the voice of Sherlock Holmes barely recognizable beneath the raspy cadence of old Silas. "The Stock Exchange breathes its first breath in 2 hours. The consortium will already be in position." "But where, Holmes?" I whispered, looking up at the massive, imposing facade of the exchange. "The building is a fortress. If they are inside, how do we find them without alerting their lookouts? We do not look for the men, Watson. We look for the light." He gestured vaguely with his broom toward the great glass dome that crowned the building. To manipulate the refractive index of an entire hall, they require a localized source, a master lens to calibrate the distortion. It must be placed where it has a clear line of sight to the main trading floor and the telegraphic tickers. Holmes, or Silas, began to shuffle toward a narrow maintenance alleyway that fed into the bowels of the exchange. I followed, playing the role of his surly younger assistant. We passed a slumbering constable and a few early morning clerks, none of whom spared a glance for 2 ragged scavengers. Inside the maintenance tunnels, the air grew thick with the smell of grease and coal dust. Holmes moved with a predatory grace that belied his stooped disguise. He stopped before a heavy iron grate that looked out over the main trading floor. Even in the dim light, the vastness of the House of Glass was breathtaking. "Look there, Watson," Holmes hissed, pointing his broom handle toward the gallery. Nestled behind an ornate marble pillar was a device that looked entirely out of place in a house of commerce. It was a brass-bound cylinder, similar to a telescope but vastly more complex, fitted with a series of rotating crystal discs. A faint humming sound emanated from it, the unmistakable vibration of a high-frequency electrical coil. "The projector," I breathed. "Half of it," Holmes corrected. The other half is likely in the telegraph room. They aren't just hiding people, Watson. They're going to refract the very numbers on the tape. When the opening bell rings, the world will see a precipitous drop in imperial consoles, triggering a panic. While the world sells in a frenzy, the consortium's agents, standing right there in the pit, invisible to the eye, will buy up the Empire's debt for a pittance. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed through the hall. We pressed ourselves into the shadows of the grate. 2 men emerged onto the gallery. One was Julian Vane, looking haggard and terrified. The other was a tall, aristocratic figure in a pristine frock coat, his face obscured by the tilt of his silk hat. "Is it ready, Vane?" the tall man asked. The voice was cold, cultured, and chillingly familiar. It was the voice of Lord Aristhorpe, the Under-Secretary for Naval Intelligence. The fourth axiom is stabilized," Vane stammered. "But Sir Alistair was right. The power required. It's unstable. If the lenses overheat, the refraction will shatter. The glass dome could collapse." "A secondary concern," Aristhorpe replied smoothly. "By the time the glass falls, the wealth of London will have changed hands. Secure the final alignment. And remember, Lady Stirling's safety depends entirely on the clarity of your optics." As they moved toward the telegraph room, Holmes reached into his pocket and withdrew a small lead-lined vial. "What is that?" I asked. "The antidote to their deception, Watson. It is a concentrated silver nitrate aerosol. If I can introduce this into the path of their master lens, it will tarnish the light. The refraction will fail, and the invisible agents will be revealed in a cloud of metallic dust. But I must get to the gallery." "And what of Lady Stirling?" "That is where you come in, old friend." Aristhorpe mentioned the final alignment. "That requires a secondary station. Based on the geometry of this hall, there is only one other vantage point, the clock tower across the street. She is being held there, Watson. You must storm the tower while I disrupt the machine. If I succeed, they will have no choice but to reveal their hand." "But Holmes, you're unarmed." He flashed a grim, fleeting smile, the first I had seen in days. "I have my wits and a vial of silver, Watson. In a house made of glass, those are the most lethal weapons of all. Go. The clock is at 12 minutes to the hour. When the bell strikes, the illusion must end." The minute hand of the great clock across from the exchange gave a heavy, metallic click as it settled upon the hour of 10. At that precise moment, the opening bell chimed, a deep, resonant sound that signaled the start of the day's commerce. Below, the trading pit erupted into its customary frenzy of shouting men and fluttering papers. I had successfully breached the clock tower, subduing a solitary, startled sentry with a blow from the butt of my revolver. Lady Stirling was there, bound and terrified beside a secondary optical relay that hummed with a sickly blue light. As I cut her cords, I looked down through the tower window. The scene in the exchange was shifting. To the frantic brokers on the floor, the massive blackened chalkboards that displayed the value of imperial consoles began to flicker. I saw men gasp and point. The numbers were plummeting at a rate that defied economic logic. A wave of panic, tangible even from my height, swept through the crowd. Men began to scream, "Sell!" and collapse. Yet curiously, in the very center of the floor, a small pocket of space remained eerily calm. Suddenly, a cloud of glittering silver dust erupted from the maintenance gallery. It caught the morning light streaming through the glass dome, turning the air into a shimmering tapestry of metallic fog. "Now!" a voice roared, the unmistakable commanding baritone of Sherlock Holmes. The effect was instantaneous and terrifying. The silver nitrate particles adhered to the invisible boundaries of the refractive field. The empty space in the center of the pit suddenly distorted, like a heat haze breaking, and 3 men appeared where, a second before, there had been nothing but air. They were dressed as common clerks, but they were frantically clutching bundles of buy orders, gorging themselves on the discounted debt of the nation. On the gallery, the tall figure of Lord Aristhorpe recoiled as his master lens began to hiss and crackle, the silver dust short-circuiting the delicate optical balance. The invisible beam of light, now tarnished by the nitrate, became visible as a jagged artificial lightning bolt stretching from the gallery to the floor. Holmes, shedding his tattered old Silas's coat like a serpent's skin, stepped into the light of the gallery. He looked every inch the avenging spirit of logic. Lestrade and a dozen plainclothes officers surged from the shadows, pinning Aristhorpe against the marble balustrade. "The game is over, my lord," Holmes said, his voice ringing out over the dying clamour of the pit. "The fourth axiom has returned to its natural state." An hour later the exchange had been cleared, and the panic stayed by an emergency declaration. We stood in the private offices of the Board of Governors, Holmes, Lestrade, Julian Vane, and myself. Aristhorpe had been led away in irons, his face a mask of aristocratic fury. "It was a gamble of staggering proportions," Holmes explained, lighting a cigarette with trembling fingers, the only sign of his exhaustion. "The consortium was a cabal of high-ranking officials within naval intelligence who saw in Sir Alister's work a way to fund their own shadow government. By manipulating the refractive index of the air within the exchange, they could create a blind spot. Within that spot, their agents could operate unseen, while the projectors distorted the light reaching the rest of the room to display false prices on the boards." "But the fourth axiom," I asked. "How did that lead you to the truth?" "Fermat's principle of least time," Holmes said. "Light always takes the path that requires the least time. In a room of standard air, that is a straight line. But Sir Alister discovered that by using high-frequency electrical fields and cobalt-tempered glass, he could change the time light took to travel through specific pockets of air. He literally bent the path of the light around the consortium's agents. When he realized they intended to use it for a financial coup rather than naval signaling, he threatened to expose them. They murdered him with his own cobalt neurotoxin to ensure his silence and framed Vane to close the case." Julian Vane looked up, his eyes wet with gratitude. "But how did you know about the mirror, Mr. Holmes?" "The mirror in the laboratory was the prototype's undoing," Holmes remarked. "A mirror reflects reality. If the room is being distorted by a refractive field, the mirror, being outside that field, will reflect the truth behind the illusion. The shadow I saw in the mirror was the physical space the machine was trying to hide. From that moment, I knew I was not looking for a ghost, but for a physicist with the soul of a thief." And the 13th hour, Lestrade asked. "A simple countdown, Inspector. The exchange opens at 10. The consortium's preparations began at 9. 10 plus 3 is 13. It was Sir Alister's way of noting the time the House of Glass would be subverted, a brilliant man, even in his final moments. The days following the confrontation at the stock exchange were a blur of official inquiries, sensationalist headlines, and a profound sense of relief that swept through the city. The mirage of Threadneedle Street, as the press had taken to calling it, was hailed as the most audacious criminal conspiracy of the century, while the public marveled at the tales of invisible men and distorted light. The inner circles of the government were left reeling by the betrayal of Lord Aristhorpe. Julian Vane was, of course, exonerated of all charges. The poor man was quite overcome when Holmes and I visited him at his lodgings a few days later. He had been returned his position at the Isle of Dogs laboratory, which was now under the direct, and much more transparent, supervision of the Royal Society. "I owe you my life, Mr. Holmes," Vane said, his hand still trembling slightly as he poured tea, "and my sanity. There were moments in that cell when I truly believed I had gone mad, that the laws of physics I had studied my entire life had simply ceased to function." "Nature is never the liar, Mr. Vane," Holmes replied, leaning back in his chair and watching the steam rise from his cup. "It is only our perception of it that can be manipulated. You were merely the victim of a man who understood the how but lacked the moral why." Later that evening, as Holmes and I sat once again in our familiar chairs at 221B Baker Street, the fire crackling in the grate, I found myself reflecting on the sheer scale of what we had witnessed. The room was quiet, the only sound the scratching of my pen as I made notes for my eventual chronicle of the case. "You know, Holmes," I said, pausing to look at my friend, It occurs to me that the consortium was remarkably close to succeeding. Had you not noticed that single discrepancy in the mirror, that one shadow out of place, London would be in ruins tonight. Holmes looked up from a copy of Nature, his expression thoughtful. Discrepancy is the only true currency of the detective, Watson. Most people see the world as a finished painting. I see it as a series of brushstrokes. If one stroke is applied in the wrong direction, the entire composition is compromised. The mirror did not lie because it could not. It is a passive observer. The machine, however, was active. It was trying to convince, and in the effort to convince, it left a trail. But what of the technology, I asked? The cobalt neurotoxin, the refractive projectors, surely they are too dangerous to be left in the hands of the Admiralty. The Admiralty has already dismantled the House of Glass, Holmes said, his voice dropping a register. The equipment has been moved to a secure facility in the Scottish Highlands. They claim it is for safekeeping, but we both know that the dream of invisibility is too seductive for any military mind to truly abandon. Sir Alister's fourth axiom will be studied, refined, and perhaps in another 50 years it will become a commonplace of warfare. He sighed, a rare sound of weariness from a man who usually seemed made of iron. It is the curse of the innovator, Watson. One builds a lighthouse to save ships, and another uses the same light to lure them onto the rocks. A knock at the door signaled the arrival of the evening post. Among the bills and circulars was a heavy, cream-colored envelope embossed with the seal of the Prime Minister. Holmes opened it with a silver letter opener, scanned the contents, and then tossed it into the fire without a word. Was that not a letter of thanks from the Cabinet? I asked, somewhat shocked. It was a request for my silence regarding Lord Aristhorpe's specific motivations, Holmes said, watching the paper curl and blacken in the flames. They wish to frame it as a lone act of madness rather than a systemic rot within naval intelligence. They offer a knighthood in exchange for my discretion. A knighthood, Holmes? Surely I have already declined a similar honor from the French, Watson, and I see no reason to change my habits for the English. My reward is the puzzle, and the satisfaction of seeing the House of Glass shattered. Besides, he added with a sharp, mischievous glint in his eye, Sir Sherlock Holmes sounds like a character from a mediocre romance novel. I much prefer the simple Mr. It provides much better cover for the street sweepers and the dock workers who are my true peers. He stood up, stretching his long limbs. But enough of the past. The fog is lifting, and I believe I saw a very peculiar-looking man loitering near the corner of Marylebone Road earlier. He had the unmistakable gait of a professional thief, but was carrying a violin case with the reverence of a priest. I suspect, Watson, that the city is finally beginning to wake up again. The final echoes of the consortium affair faded as quickly as the fog that had once blanketed the Isle of Dogs. Life in London resumed its rhythmic, indifferent pulse. The stock exchange, though briefly rattled, found its footing as the government moved with uncharacteristic speed to bury the more fantastical details of the plot. To the average man on the street, it was merely another financial scare, thwarted by the diligent, if unimaginative, work of Scotland Yard. It was a week later, on a crisp, sunlit morning in Baker Street, that I found Holmes back in his usual element. The chemical apparatus had been cleared away, and the smell of ozone had been replaced by the more domestic aroma of fresh coffee and toast. Holmes sat by the window, his violin tucked under his chin, coaxing a hauntingly beautiful melody from its strings. "I see you are in a musical mood, Holmes," I remarked, looking up from my morning paper. "A celebration of your recent victory?" He stopped playing, the bow suspended in mid-air. "Victory, Watson? It was merely a corrective measure. The universe has a set of laws. Aristhorpe and his ilk attempted to rewrite them for personal gain. I simply restored the original text." "Still," I persisted, "to have seen through a deception that utilized the very light itself, it was a remarkable feat of deduction. I've been reviewing my notes on the fourth axiom. It is fascinating how a principle so absolute could be used to create such a profound lie." Holmes set the violin aside and leaned forward, his eyes sharp and clear. That is the paradox of truth, Watson. The more absolute a law is, the more effectively it can be used to deceive if one knows how to tilt the lens. Fermat's principle, the idea that light takes the path of least time, is a beautiful logical certainty, but Aristhorpe forgot that the path of least time is not always the path of least discovery. Logic, like light, eventually finds its way to the surface, no matter how many prisms you place in its way. I smiled, shaking my head. Lestrade was here earlier while you were out. He mentioned that the official report will list the cause of Sir Alister's death as misadventure with laboratory chemicals. They are keeping the blue neurotoxin and the refraction technology under a very heavy shroud. Naturally, Holmes said with a dry chuckle, the state is a jealous guardian of its monsters. They will spend years trying to replicate Aristhorpe's machine, hoping to hide their own secrets, never realizing that the greatest hiding place in the world is not behind a lens of glass, but behind the vanity of the human mind. Men see what they expect to see, Watson. That is the only true invisibility that exists. He rose and paced the room, his energy beginning to simmer once more. But tell me, did you see the man I mentioned yesterday? The one with the violin case? I did, I replied. He has been standing on the opposite pavement for the last 20 minutes, staring up at our window. He looks quite distressed. And did you notice his boots? I'm afraid I didn't, I admitted. Mud-stained, Watson, but not the soot-heavy mud of the London docks. It was a pale, chalky clay, likely from the Surrey hills. And the violin case? It is far too heavy for a musical instrument. Note how his shoulder dips under the weight. It contains something dense, perhaps a set of surveyor's tools, or, more likely, a collection of geological samples. As if on cue, our doorbell rang, a sharp, crisp peal that echoed through the house. "Ah," Holmes said, his face lighting up with that familiar predatory gleam, the Surrey geologist with a penchant for musical subterfuge. "It seems the last call of the consortium has been silenced, only to be replaced by a new refrain." He turned to me, his hand on the door handle. "Are you ready for another journey into the inexplicable, Watson? Or has the House of Glass quite exhausted your appetite for the truth?" I reached for my hat and followed him toward the stairs, a sense of renewed anticipation warming my chest. "As long as you are the one holding the lantern, Holmes, I am always ready." "Excellent," he cried, his voice ringing with delight. "Then let us see what secrets the chalk hills of Surrey have sent to our door. Life is infinitely more clever than we are, Watson. We must do our best to keep up. And so, with the memory of the consortium fading into the annals of my journals, we descended the stairs together, stepping out of the shadows of the past and into the bright, uncompromising light of a new mystery. While the public's attention was occupied by the scandalous trial of Lord Aristhorpe at the Old Bailey, a quieter, perhaps more significant drama was unfolding within the walls of 221B Baker Street. The consortium had been decapitated, its primary architect in irons, yet the mystery of Sir Alister Sterling's dying words, specifically his frantic mention of a blueprint, remained a thorn in the side of Sherlock Holmes's curiosity. It was a fortnight after the events at the Stock Exchange when Lady Sterling, now a widow of immense poise despite her grief, arrived at our rooms. She carried a small iron-bound dispatch box, the key to which had been found sewn into the lining of Sir Alister's favourite smoking jacket, a detail even the thorough searchers of Scotland Yard had overlooked. "Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice steady as she placed the box on our mahogany table. Alister was a man of many secrets, but he was also a man of profound foresight. He told me once that if anything should happen to him, the heart of the light must only be given to the one man in London who could see through shadows. I believe he meant you. Holmes opened the box with the same reverence a scholar might show an ancient codex. Inside, resting atop a bed of velvet, was the blueprint. It was not, as I had expected, a technical schematic for the refractive lenses or the electrical coils we had seen at the Isle of Dogs. Instead, it was a translucent, multi-layered map of London, etched onto thin sheets of architectural vellum. "Incredible," Holmes whispered, his long fingers tracing the fine white lines that crisscrossed the city's underground. "Watson, look at this. These are not just streets and sewers. These are the arteries of the empire." I leaned in, peering through the magnifying glass Holmes pushed toward me. "They look like telegraph cables, Holmes. They are the primary pneumatic and telegraphic lines connecting the Admiralty, the Foreign Office, and the Bank of England," Holmes explained, his eyes alight with a cold intellectual fire. "And here, look at these annotations in the margins. N equal to 1. 0,00293. The refractive index of air at sea level. But here, he has calculated the index for a vacuum, equal to $1. He began to overlay the translucent sheets. As he did, a pattern emerged. The house of glass in the Isle of Dogs was marked with a red circle, but there were 3 other circles, positioned with mathematical precision at the corners of a vast, invisible triangle that encompassed the very heart of the British government. The 4th axiom was never just about a financial coup at the stock exchange, Watson, Holmes said, standing up and beginning to pace the room. The consortium's ambition was far more breathtaking and far more terrifying. They didn't just want to hide men in the trading pit. They wanted to create a refractive vault over the entire Westminster district. "A vault?" I asked, struggling to grasp the magnitude of the concept. By positioning 4 synchronized projectors at these coordinates, Holmes pointed to the map. They could have manipulated the light entering and leaving the government quarter. To the outside world, the buildings would appear normal, even as they were being systematically looted or their occupants replaced. It was to be a kingdom of mirrors, where the truth of the empire's leadership could be substituted for a carefully curated illusion. The stock exchange was merely a proof of concept, a way to generate the capital necessary to fund the final global-scale refraction. "And the blueprint?" Lady Stirling asked, her eyes wide. "What does it mean now?" "It means, madam, that your husband was the only one who realized that the technology he created for the safety of ships was being turned into a shroud for the nation," Holmes replied solemnly. "This blueprint is the only record of the network's calibration. Without it, Aristhorpe's successors, for there are always successors to such power, cannot reassemble the machine." He turned to the fireplace, where a brisk blaze was consuming the morning's coal. "Mr. Holmes," I cried, sensing his intent, "surely that document is of incalculable value to the state. It is of incalculable danger to the world, Watson," Holmes said firmly. He looked at Lady Stirling, who gave a slow, somber nod of approval. Holmes cast the blueprint into the heart of the fire. We watched in silence as the vellum curled, the intricate lines of the refractive vault blackening and vanishing into the updraft. For a moment, the flames flared with an unnatural sapphire blue light, the ghost of the cobalt-treated inks, before returning to their mundane orange hue. "The secret of the 4th axiom dies with Sir Alistair," Holmes said, his voice reflecting a rare moment of somber respect. "We shall tell Lestrade we found only personal letters. The world is not yet ready for a light that can hide the truth of an entire city." The last embers of Sir Alistair Stirling's blueprint had long since turned to grey flakes in our fireplace before the silence in the room was truly broken. Lady Stirling had departed, her heavy mourning veil drawn tight, leaving behind a lingering scent of lavender and the weight of a secret that could have toppled a government. I watched Holmes as he sat in his chair, his chin resting upon his interlaced fingers. The high-strung energy that had sustained him through the long nights of the investigation had ebbed, replaced by a quiet, contemplative melancholy. It was in these moments, after the chase had ended and the culprit was secured, that the true complexity of my friend's nature was most apparent. He was not merely a calculating machine, he was a man who felt the burden of the truths he uncovered. "You are thinking of the vault, Holmes," I said softly, breaking the stillness. "I am thinking of the fragile nature of reality, Watson," he replied, without moving his gaze from the dying fire. "We walk through these streets, we look at the monuments of our empire, and we believe them to be solid, immutable facts. But we have seen how easily the light can be bent. We have seen how a few prisms and a cobalt-treated lens can turn the seat of power into a house of ghosts. A sharp rap at the door announced Inspector Lestrade. He entered with a brisk professional air, though his eyes lacked their usual spark of triumph. He carried a copy of the evening edition of the Gazette. "It's finished, Mr. Holmes," Lestrade said, tapping the lead headline. "Lord Aristhorpe has been stripped of his titles and sentenced to life imprisonment at Dartmoor. The official record states he was suffering from a temporary derangement brought on by overwork and a fascination with the occult. There is no mention of the consortium or the signaling devices. A convenient fiction, Lestrade," Holmes remarked, a trace of bitterness in his voice. "And what of Julian Vane? He has been granted a private pension by the Admiralty on the condition that he never speaks of his work again. He's moving to the countryside, Somerset, I believe. He said to tell you that he finally understands the fourth axiom. It isn't just about the path of least time, it's about the path of least harm." Lestrade lingered for a moment, looking as though he wanted to ask more about the missing blueprint, but something in Holmes's icy, distant gaze deterred him. With a polite nod to me and a grunt of acknowledgement to Holmes, the inspector withdrew, his heavy boots fading down the stairs. I turned back to my notes, the case now complete in my mind. "The last call from Baker Street," I murmured. "It is a fitting title, Holmes. A man dying on our doorstep to prevent the world from becoming an illusion." "It was a close-run thing, Watson," Holmes said, rising and reaching for his pipe. "Aristhorpe's mistake was not one of science, but of psychology. He believed that because he could control what people saw, he could control what they knew. He forgot that the human heart, for all its flaws, has a stubborn instinct for the truth. One cannot hide a crime forever behind a wall of glass. The light always finds a crack." He walked over to the window, pulling aside the heavy velvet curtain. Outside, the London night was once again thick with fog, the street lamps flickering like dying stars. It was the same city as before, yet to my eyes it felt different, more mysterious, more precarious. "You look troubled, old friend," Holmes noted, a flicker of his old warmth returning. "I suppose I am," I admitted. "I find myself wondering how many other consortiums are operating in the shadows of this great city. How many other axioms are being broken without us ever knowing?" "There are always shadows, Watson," Holmes said, his voice quiet but firm, "and there will always be those who seek to use the light to blind rather than to lead. But as long as there are those who are willing to look at the world with a clear eye, to notice the shadow out of place, the scuff on a boot, or the smudge of blue on a lip, the illusion can never truly be complete." He turned away from the window, his attention suddenly caught by a small, nondescript envelope that had been slipped under the door during Lestrade's departure. He tore it open, his eyes scanning the contents with lightning speed. "Aha!" he exclaimed, his face suddenly transformed by a surge of renewed interest. "It seems my Surrey geologist was not a geologist at all, Watson. This letter is from a very frantic young lady in Kensington who claims that her brother has been replaced by a man who looks exactly like him, yet does not know the name of the family dog." "Another case of displacement?" I asked, a weary smile tugging at my lips. "Perhaps, or perhaps a much simpler case of inheritance and greed," Holmes said, grabbing his deerstalker. "But it is a problem, Watson, and the mind cannot rest while there are problems to be solved. Come, the fog is thick, the night is young, and I believe we have just enough time to catch the last hansom to Kensington." I put down my pen, the ink of the case of the last call still wet on the page. The world of the consortium was gone, replaced by the immediate, tangible reality of a new puzzle. I followed Sherlock Holmes out of the room, leaving the dying fire and the shadows of the house of glass behind us, heading once more into the gas-lit labyrinth of London.